So today we've got a video on making NextJS applications fast everywhere for everyone. So there's a couple of ways we'll do this, but to begin with, let's have a look at what the database has. So let's have a look at a super simple database. I've literally got a very basic application, NextJS application, that has Drizzle and Terso installed. So if we have a look at the database, it's just London, Manchester, Paris, and a country ID, which in this case is the UK and France. So this is currently running localhost. And when we have a look at the speed that it hits the database, it's relatively fast. 29, 47, 30, it's averaging around 30 milliseconds per request. And this isn't including the actual rendering time that the server takes. So let's have a look at what happens when we upload it to Vercel. So we finally have a Vercel server set up for hosting our Next.js application. So if we have a look, and if I hit refresh a couple of times, you can see that the database request is generally taking around 100 milliseconds, and that's a lot more than it was in the localhost. And the reason is because the Vercel server is actually hosted in the US. I could have set it up to the UK, but that kind of defeats the point. I want this to be fast everywhere. Now, if we have a look at how long it actually took for everything to render out, it's approximately 650 milliseconds. I've got between 600 and 650 milliseconds. So as you can imagine, the further away your users are from your database, the longer it's going to take. So how do we get about this? There's a couple of things we can do. But first, let's understand why this is taking so long. I'm based in the UK, so the UK request is going to the Vercel server in the US. The Vercel server in the US is then hitting the database server, which is Terso, in the UK. The Terso server in the UK is returning the data back to the Vercel server in the US, and then the Vercel server in the US is rendering out the application and then sending the data back to me, which is what I can see in the browser. And that whole process takes a long time, and obviously 600 milliseconds doesn't sound like a lot, but in larger workloads and larger applications, this can massively increase the time it takes for users to get doing whatever they're doing. So how do we actually improve this? Let's have a look. To begin with, what I'm going to do is I will set up a replica in the US, Boston. Let's do that. And what this embedded replica does, it creates a replica of all the data that's in London and replicates it in Boston. That way, the Vercel server in the US doesn't need to travel as far to hit the database server, and that should speed it up. So as you can see, that's jumped from approximately 150 milliseconds down to 30 milliseconds, which is massive improvement. Let's say it's averaging around 35 to 40 milliseconds, which is fantastic. But the actual application is still taking a long time to render, 500 milliseconds. I wonder if we can do anything to speed that up. Alright, well, there's one thing that I can do to make this a bit faster, and that's switch the runtimes from Node.js to Edge. So the way to do that in a Next.js application is to add this line. I've added it in the layout.tsx file, and I've published it again to Vercel. Now Vercel's Edge runtime runs on top of Cloudflare, and if you don't know what an Edge runtime actually is, it's just a bit of smaller powered compute that runs closer to your users. Cloudflare has around 300 data centers around the world, whereas AWS has, I think, like 40, maybe? I don't know. It's massively closer to the end users, but you get the drawback of not being able to do as much. There's limitations on the packages that you can use, as well as the duration of compute you can use. Alright, so what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to run the normal Node.js application, but I'm going to connect to an Australian VPN. So if I just move this out of the way, and then I hit this a couple more times, let's have a look at how long it takes. It took a total of 6 seconds for it to run in Australia. Let's see if we can create an embedded replica in Australia. Sydney, Australia, hit create. Awesome. Now we have our data replicated across 3 locations in the world. This is still the Node.js runtime. So the total time to query the database was only 43 milliseconds, and the total time it took was 2 seconds. So as you can see, we're still connected to Australia, but if we refresh this page, you can see that the time taken to hit the database is down to around 20 milliseconds, and we've jumped from between 2 and 6 seconds all the way down to 1 second. And most of that time is because I'm connected to a VPN, which is bottlenecking. So if I actually go ahead and disconnect, that way I'm connected to just my Wi-Fi going directly to closest edge region provided by Cloudflare, which is, I believe, London. We can see that the actual time it takes to complete the entire request has jumped from 600 milliseconds down to 300 milliseconds. And I'm sure that you could shave a couple more things off if you removed a couple more dependencies. If you wrote raw SQL as opposed to interacting through Drizzle, I'm sure you could bring that down further, but jumping from 600 milliseconds, if not more, down to 300 milliseconds is fantastic. And also taking the database request time down to 30 milliseconds, averaging 30 milliseconds from 150 milliseconds is fantastic. There are always things that you can do to make a Next.js application faster. Here were two ways. One was to create embedded replicas closer to your users, and secondly, to enable Edge. That's all for me. I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know what you guys think in the comments.